I'm at the Red House with Gerry Stanek. Thank you for coming over and hanging out.
Great to be here, Tyler. Thank you.
Yeah, man. We've been talking already about the music industry and getting to know each other, about how it all works. So in the spirit of continuing to get to know each other, just to back up a little bit.
Okay.
Where did music start for you?
Music started for me in Western Pennsylvania. I grew up in a small coal mining town. My dad was a coal miner. And all I knew, my dad played in polka bands. On weekends. And that's a thing, you know, if you're European immigrants, Western Pennsylvania, the polka looms large. And, you know, people here might not understand that, but it was a huge thing. And my dad played in bands on weekends. He was a drummer and a singer. So in that world, all I knew was that people played in cover bands. And I can remember being 14 or 15 and people who made records were otherworldly. And that didn't seem like something people like me could or might do.
Right.
And that your option was to play in cover bands. So from the time I was 15, that's what I did. And it was, you know, union halls, American Legions, VFWs, teen dances. I was doing that stuff from about the time I was 15, and that's where I learned to be in a band and where I learned how to play music, I guess.
Were you playing guitar in these bands?
I started with guitar, and it's kind of one of those typical stories where my best friend was a much better guitar player than me. So when we needed a bass player, it was me.
Gotcha.
And so bass became my main instrument. And by the time I was in my 20s, we were doing that for a living. It was crazy, just playing covers around Western Pennsylvania, but we literally could play like 24, 25 times in a month because there was a market for it.
Right.
At that time, you know, so we were playing songs by Neil Young and the Beatles and the Smithereens and making a living at it. So that's really where it began.
What kind of this environment you're talking about in Pennsylvania? I mean, we're talking about rural land. I guess and I feel like in Pennsylvania you get this spectrum of Amish to Philly, and like where do we fall in that spectrum?
Yeah, so this would be closer to the Pittsburgh side of things.
Okay.
And you know, if you're looking at a map, about 75 miles east to the right of Pittsburgh on a map in the Allegheny Mountains. So a lot of coal mining areas, steel mills in smaller cities like Johnstown. So really very rural, but with a lot of small towns just kind of dotted through that area. But there were always bars who had live music and people who wanted to dance and drink beer and smoke cigarettes and
my kind of people.
Yeah, so I mean at times, I mean, I saw so many bar fights.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, things like that. So some bars were nicer than others.
Sure.
But it was a neat way to learn about people and about life. You know, I remember for me growing up in this tiny place, to travel 2 hours north in Pennsylvania seemed exotic.
Like you were adventuring.
Yeah. And so I did that until, I guess, you know, by the time I hit maybe 25, it had dawned on me that there was more to life than playing covers. And I was writing songs and recording them on a 4-track and really didn't know what all of that meant or what I would do with it. But I remember wanting to write songs and and just deciding on my own that, well, if I want to do this, it's a craft like anything else. And I just started to write songs every day.
Yeah.
So I could figure out how to do it.
Yeah, and you mentioned kind of that person in your mind was not, that wasn't even accessible to you. That was a different world of person. Yeah. But yet you started doing it anyway. Like, how did what do you remember about the shift into being like, no, I can do this? Or maybe from there, how did you decide this is something that I can even pursue beyond just doing it here?
Right. I think probably more than anything, I would just have to say the desire to write songs became so strong that I couldn't ignore it. Because I listened to records, and I've always been a sort of obsessive listener. So I remember a big turning point for me. Somebody introduced me to an album by Graham Parker called Squeezing Out Sparks. And he's sort of like a Elvis Costello type. I don't know if you're familiar with him. But a British guy who'd been, like a service station attendant. But I got this album, Squeezing Out Sparks, and I was fascinated by how smart the lyrics were. And they weren't just like about girls. They were about deeper stuff. And I don't even know why, but I wanted to do that. I wanted to emulate what he was doing and try to write lyrics that maybe said something and were a little smarter than, I love this song, so I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but a little smarter than love me do, I love you. So it was just like a mission to be able to do that. And I didn't know what it meant in a bigger way or where it would take me.
That is really interesting. I remember I've referred to this before. So for anybody who listens religiously, forgive me for repeating myself, but one of the things I remembered most, the observations from Levon Helm's book about a time period of music that precedes that by a little bit, was kind of the shift from songs that were about love and girls and like partying on the weekend and another Saturday night. And
right.
Then that shift into the intellectualism, that shift into like, Bob Dylan and the Beatles, almost like abstract thought being introduced into the culture, into the mainstream for almost arguably the first time that we can,
without a doubt,
we can call documented.
And the fact that, and I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought.
No, go right ahead.
But the fact it always blows me away that like one of my favorite Bob Dylan songs is "It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding," and this 7-minute song that just seems so profound, and he touches on so many things, and he's like 23 when he writes it.
Yeah,
is just mind-blowing.
Same as fast forward in time a little bit. People often refer to These Days by Jackson Browne, and they love to say, and he was only like 16 or 17 when he wrote it.
Yeah.
There's something weird about wisdom and about introspection coming from the youth,
Yeah.
How old were you when you're going through this phase of what you just described with Graham Parsons?
I was 24, 25.
Okay.
So I guess I was sort of a late bloomer.
Only compared to like Bob Dylan and Jackson Browne.
Right, I would attribute that to the geography.
Exactly.
And the perception of, people from here don't do that.
Yeah.
So it was a late thing for me. Now, do you have a similar experience?
Yeah. Subject matter, I'm not sure. I was always immersed in so much of a variety of different kind of music. So with the subject matter aspect, I would say I don't think I'm aware of that But I think on the music side, yes, and I still am wrapping my head around it. I'm still in my 30s. I'm in a tug of war with this idea of status of success or whatever, like who's a real artist and who ain't one or whatever.
Right.
Like, what does it mean? It's confusing, I guess, to me lately for some reason. But
you have a big interest in words.
yes,
And it seems, from what I know about you, that it seems like that's the most important part of the creative act for you.
absolutely. And I mean, like I'm sure with both of us, we compose music. We try to be good at our instrument. I play lots of instruments. I like to try to be good at them. That's just a world that I understand and know how to use. But really, all of it revolves around writing. It's almost like writing literature.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the other part of it is, you talked about, say commercial success versus being an artist. And I've noticed my oldest daughter is 16, and she seems to be attracted to the same types of music that I'm attracted to. And she and I actually had this conversation within the last week and a half where it was this light bulb going off, like that what she likes are artists who are honest. And that's always been a big thing for me. And maybe I didn't take the time to attach that word to it for myself until she and I had the conversation.
Man, I was just having a conversation with a good friend of mine about this yesterday. So having said that, how do you think you try to identify what an honest artist is? Like, what do you think that means?
Yeah, wow, it's a good question, and I think it's a really visceral feeling that when you see it, you just know. At least that's how it feels for me. And I mean, I know what I like, and I know what I don't like. Maybe I shouldn't mention things I don't like, but I will. Like, so I love. There's an artist from Oklahoma named J.D. McPherson, and he does stuff that almost borders on like 50s R&B sometimes, and what he does seems real and never contrived to me, and I love him. And yet, when I see a band like the Foo Fighters,
Yeah.
And rest in peace, their drummer, but like, there's something about that feels false and over the top to me. And I'm not saying they're not good musicians or good songwriters, but it doesn't touch me, and something about it feels contrived.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and it's not that it shouldn't, I don't think it should be in the world. I mean, it is, and a lot of people love it, but I don't need it to be a part of my world.
Yeah. Okay. I understand the distinction. Yeah. I was having a similar conversation with a buddy of mine yesterday, and we were trying to figure out a similar question.
Well, how do you define it?
Well, I find myself in a pickle because there's one side that's like an artist that like you look at them, they're dressed like us now, like they dress casually,
Yeah.
they dress comfortably. Jackson Browne being one of those examples. Like I saw a video of him with Billy Strings. Well, actually, let's set Billy Strings to the side for a second. So I saw Jackson Browne in Asheville a few years ago, and he dressed exactly like us right now. And he came out by himself, and he played his songs, and he wrote those songs. And you can tell from the subject matter, he's writing these songs that we feel as though they reflect his experience as a person. And
And
that's
it works
probably,
like literature.
it works like literature, and that's probably what you and I do. We're in that world,
Yeah.
you know, and I think of that as really real and no bullshit. Then you have artists that absolutely just what they do is express a persona that isn't real. And there are some artists that do that I totally forgive, and it's like I understand their place in the world. Like if you like a really popularized example would be somebody like Lady Gaga. Like
Right.
we don't see her dressed in a meat dress and think, oh, that's her how she is on Sundays. She's like doing that shit on purpose. She's over the top. Elton John, you know, he goes out on stage, he's very flamboyant and stuff,
Yeah.
very like over the top. Those artists exist for a different purpose, I think. And even in the Americana or whatever acoustic world, someone like C.W. Stone King, if you don't know, do you know him?
I don't.
He's fantastic, but he's this Australian guy. This is the truth. Somebody made me a mixed CD, and I put it in my car one day, and I heard this song called "Love Me or Die," and I was like, "Oh man, this is like a recording from the 20s. Like this is so cool. I should cover this song."
Right.
I looked into the song, and it's like a contemporary artist, and he dresses in all white like Mark Twain, and he like his show looks like it's from the 30s, and you know, that's not him when he's like out at a bowling alley with his
But it's
friends.
still cool to you,
It's still
though.
cool to me.
Right.
Then there's the in-between, and this is the point. There are people who I'm aware of who take that persona thing, sell it as their real self, and don't let anybody in on the joke, I guess, and that bothers me.
Right.
Like when people capitalize, it's like I'm going to be careful here, but like I'm aware of people like I don't understand the thing where people give themselves names like Billy Strings has done. If Strings, I'm assuming Strings is not his last name.
Right.
That's one aspect of it, but worse is when like I've known a lot. I'm sorry, I'm being a little long-winded, but the point is, I've seen people take on accents that aren't how they really talk. I've seen people like take on personas where they act like they're from a totally different culture, and it's to win the fortune, to win the money, to win the status, and I don't like that shit.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's when it becomes a problem. You know, the other side of that is, you know, somebody like Tom Petty, who I love. You know, Tom Petty might come on stage with a denim jacket and a flannel shirt, and then you have something like the video for "Don't Come Around Here No More," where he's dressed as the Mad Hatter, right?
Right.
But somehow, it's still Tom Petty, and you never fight with that.
Yeah.
And you don't even see. I don't know how to articulate this, but he's so sort of malleable, and I think partially because it's Southern, he can adapt to different situations, and he can wear the suit and the sunglasses, or he can wear the denim jacket and the boots,
Right.
and it's still Tom Petty, and that's a different kind of thing than what you're talking about,
Right.
with someone who takes on a different persona. And Tom Petty is someone who I consider to be incredibly honest.
Yeah.
And, you know, like maybe the most shining example of having or keeping integrity and still being commercially successful in a huge way. At least my favorite example.
Yeah. Yeah, he is. He's kind of him and Springsteen maybe are like an example of people that we would probably consider real musicians, songwriters and such that actually maintained that through commercial success, which is a rarity, you know.
And John Mellencamp is another who I admire. I mean, the dude is in his 70s now, and he's a painter. I mean, he's still making music, but he's making the kind of music he wants to make with no consideration for, is this commercially viable?
Right.
And spending most of his creative energy now as a painter. And that seems like an important example of like, this is how you do it.
Yeah. And so with all that being said, I mean, I find myself also being tempted toward creativity in different ways. And so, because as musicians, I don't know, as musicians, sometimes we want to funnel all of our creativity into that craft. And really, if you want to be like really artists, I think the difference between a musician and an artist is that an artist might embrace every opportunity for creativity, whereas a musician might really try to funnel it into one place. Sometimes as an artist, I want to embrace more things like persona and like wardrobe and like what it means to be presenting something like an idea to people. And I have explored those things.
Yeah.
But I end up finding myself going back to this place where I'm like, this doesn't feel like I'm telling people the truth. It feels, I don't know if I'm trying to manipulate people or if I'm trying to like give them a fantasy.
But does it feel honest in the moment is the question, I guess. And, you know, I've seen videos of you where you have the suit and tie on and you look great and you look cool and it still looks like Tyler Nail to me.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
Yeah.
You know, that you have that perspective from the outside that to me, I don't question that with a person like you. So it just looks, if it looks and feels right at the given moment, then maybe it is right.
Yeah. There's a different thing with, it's so interesting, the implications of clothes. But if we think about it, it's like, it's so interesting what a suit does. And I think a suit is like great. I think a suit is awesome because it, in one context, implies this seriousness, this very serious thing that says, you know, I've heard it described as like almost like a military uniform. It's a uniform of business that says like we're playing by the same rules. We have the same sort of ideas about what our purpose is here. Of course, in corporate America, like that's something that means something.
Yeah.
And then when you put it on an artist like Tom Petty or Tom Waits or Brandon Flowers or all the like Father John Misty, Johnny Cash, like all these artists that have kind of put that on to do what they do. There's this classic Frank Sinatra like serious classiness that comes out, like a 007 thing.
Yeah, when you see that the Johnny Cash stuff from Folsom Prison, even where he's got the white shirt and the black suit,
Badass.
Yeah, it's totally rock and roll. You know, I can remember an experience when I was 15, and you're talking about cover bands, and there was a place 7 or 8 miles from my house where they every Friday and Saturday night they would have like 3 bands, and they were all cover bands. You know, but I went in there for maybe the first time that I went there when I was 15. And there were 3 bands that night, but I can remember 2 of them to this day. Like I can picture those moments. And one were these guys called Fantasy Airlift. And they come out and they do Carry On Wayward Son by Kansas, which was stunning to me in the first place for these guys to start with like the 3-part harmony, Carry On My Way. So, but then, you know, the 4 of them, the drummer has a military jacket with the golden epaulets on the shoulder and a beret and sunglasses. And the bass player has like a pinstripe suit and a skinny tie. And the keyboard player has a derby and some kind of cool jacket on. And like at that moment, you get it. Like you don't wear street clothes to play rock and roll.
Right.
So that totally kind of spits in the face of what I was trying to say about authenticity earlier, but maybe it doesn't.
Right.
Because there was something about this idea of if you're going to put on a show, if you're going to be a rock and roll musician, that somehow you have to be larger than life.
Yeah.
The question is, what is it that makes you look or feel larger than life? And maybe it's what you require as an artist. If I'm going on stage now, and I know that I somehow need to be larger than life because I'm on stage, it's no different than I went to see my daughter's performing in Wizard of Oz right now at the Carolina Theater.
Oh, cool.
And so when you go there and the makeup and the lights and the whole thing, because sure, it's a musical and they're playing parts, but it somehow needs to be larger than life because they're on stage.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe for a rock and roll band, it's not all that different.
Yeah.
The only question comes down to, I guess it is the part I'm playing when I get on stage today. I'm not on stage today, but
Yeah.
is the part I'm playing or what I'm giving the audience, regardless of what I wear or how I present myself.
Man,
Is it coming from the heart?
that's so interesting. Well, we often think of so much of life as subjective, and really, I'm not always sure if that is the case. And I'm a big believer in symbolism and the way that it translates from one thing to another. And as we're talking, I'm getting these flashes in my head, these images of what's possible, and I'm thinking to myself, like, what does it all mean? Like, what is it symbolic of, or something? And one flash of a thought I had in my mind was like, some of our roots with music performance goes back to, tribal life and religious leaders and witch doctors and shit like that. And, they would, my understanding of them is that those people too, anybody with a perception of wisdom was differentiated from the mass,
Yeah,
they were kind of,
absolutely.
they looked different. But this is where it's interesting, is like sometimes the everyman person, that is what makes you look different, and I'm thinking of somebody like, okay, I've seen like 2 TED Talks come to mind. One, a TED Talk done by a professor who his clothes matches what he does. He's got a buttoned up shirt tucked in, isn't particularly cool looking. He just looks like somebody whose brain is more valuable than his fashion sense. And then I remember one by an ex, like neo-Nazi type guy that was really intense, and his career has become really trying to convince people to, like, really save people from that ideology.
To turn them away from that.
Yeah. And he was dressed exactly like, he was wearing black jeans and a shirt like this, and he had his shirt like this where you could see his sleeve of tattoos, mm-hmm. some of which had been like blocked out or whatever from the horrible decisions he had made. He looked like a normal guy, and his message was meant for people who might want to hear that from like a normal person. Like,
yeah,
going back to the simple notion that maybe your clothes, maybe more so than we even recognize, the way that we express ourselves that way really are inseparably representative of what our message is, like what the point of what we're trying to do is.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And I dress very habitually in jeans, and this jacket is kind of like a daily thing, and flannel shirts. And I guess that says something about me, and at some place along the line, I made a decision that I'm not a person who wears polo shirts, for instance. And,
right.
I mean, polo shirts are fine. I don't find them to be particularly comfortable, but the fact that I don't wear, say, khakis and polo shirts is, I think it does say something about who I am, and maybe that's a conscious choice. But I'm not sure I know what it means. I think it speaks somewhat to who I think I am, to my roots, which are certainly attached to a more working class idea.
Yeah.
than anything that falls outside of that. Because I carry that with me as a sort of badge of pride. Like, I'm proud that my dad was a coal miner and that my grandfathers were coal miners. I don't know if that is connected to the way I choose to present myself to the world, but maybe it is.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, what are your thoughts on that? You know, because you have your thing.
Yep.
And you're here today in your work boots and your hat and your jeans.
Yep.
Do you feel like that's connected to who you are?
Yeah, and I think it's something that I don't even like to acknowledge that part often. Like, and I think this is what we were talking about. Like, the subjectivity of it. Like, I think that's another way of saying that might be people don't like to acknowledge that they're aware of these things or something.
Okay. Yes.
And for me, this is something I have to admit. Like, yes, I am totally aware of this. I don't find it non-masculine or non-whatever, non-genuine to be aware of these things. I mean, I just, when I was like 19, I was like, I noticed that some people wore basketball shoes all the time and they looked like 12-year-olds. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. Like,
Right.
I want boots and I like them and they make me feel capable. And like, if I were to get in a fight, I could really kick somebody hard.
Yes, you could. Yes, you could.
Same with like, at one point I actually decided not to wear jeans as much, but then I kind of brought them back into my life, brought denim back into my life. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm going through these thoughts and I don't share them with anybody, but I'm thinking of it as like, what matches with my sense of myself and what doesn't.
Yeah, you know, maybe you just said it there, you know, because isn't it all about how we perceive ourselves? And I have an old friend who used to call me the particular bum. Like, yeah, he's dressed like a bum, but he's real careful about, you know, whatever his ensemble happens to be that day.
Yeah.
And maybe that is vain in a way, because we're all vain and we're all paradoxes. So there you have it. I chose this outfit today.
But that's the thing. Like, if you just can accept that, then it's fine. And no one gives a fuck anymore because everybody else knows it and they do the same thing, you know? And if they don't, then they really don't care. You know, I know people that really don't care, but yeah. I mean, when I think not caring is probably the whole, like, just wearing stretchy pants and a sweater all the time, you know? But you know, then there's that nothing. Like, I mean, like big ass celebrity people do that too as a statement. So everything can be a statement. Who gives
and
a
yet
shit?
it's like the coolest thing in the world when, you know, the early Beatles with their suits.
Yeah.
Like, I love that. And we talked about Dylan. And when you see, have you seen the No Direction Home documentary?
Yeah.
Which is just amazing. But when he goes on stage in 1966 in England with those suits, it's like, he's the coolest guy in the world.
Yeah.
Right there.
Yeah.
But he is Dylan. So he's carrying something with him that your average Joe doesn't have. And not everybody could have pulled off a suit like that.
True.
Or the hair.
Yeah, you know. So what comes to mind one thing that comes to mind. So I met somebody who is going to be on the podcast soon, who's a well-known business entity in Winston, who's like she started a company. I'll save on the details until she's here, but recently haven't been able to meet her and talk to her and stuff. There's this thing about authenticity that she talks about, being truly sort of authentically yourself a lot. But when I've experienced her, it's like I'm experiencing an archetype of a person. But I think that's important. I think that's what it kind of comes down to sometimes is we're not going to like when we try to grab a hold of our identities, they're often not brand new identities. I mean, there's the uniqueness of ourselves. There's the what's been called the ultimate minority, which is the self, and of course it exists separate from everybody else, and that's, you get to keep that. But there's this idea, the Carl Jungian idea, the Joseph Campbell idea, the idea of an archetype that we kind of become. And I think for a lot of people, what that actually means, and really deciding to be yourself, is letting yourself choose one of those identities and live it out fully.
Right. Well, and isn't, living it out fully the most difficult thing, but also the most important thing?
Yeah.
I'm a person who, I think a lot about my potential as a human being. And conversely, I've always felt like the biggest sin, if we want to go into that neighborhood, and I might even mean sin either in a secular way or a religious way.
Yeah.
But that the biggest sin is to not live up to your potential. So you have, you're given natural talents and gifts that we seem to gravitate to. And for me, it was at a very young age. I mean, my earliest memories being 3, 4 years old, like I was fascinated with the Beatles. So when I got old enough, I wanted a guitar. And that was my natural tendency to move in that direction. I think. I don't think that was an accident. Mm-hmm. That I was first attracted to the music and then latched onto the idea of I want to be a person who can do that, can make that music. So for my 7th birthday, I get a guitar, and I'm not unique in saying that was a life-changing event,
Right?
Because getting the guitar forced me to move toward my potential, forced me, to work harder at that, at using the instrument, and then at songwriting, which is an extension of that. Those two things forced me, I don't know if forced is the right word, but pushed me to work harder at them than I've ever worked at anything in my life, to master them somehow. And not to say that I have mastered them, but
That was the calling.
yeah. So, and I think I have to assume that everyone is born with that same kind of direction. Whether it's the ability to play a guitar or, to be a doctor. It could be someone's natural tendency just as well. So if you don't move toward that gift in the best way that you know how, then maybe you're failing somehow. And if you stifle that gift, then you might have real problems. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's where depression and things like that come from. Man, because you've separated yourself from the best of you. And I think about this a lot.
You should. I mean, that's what we all would benefit to think about more. And it's so interesting to me that you chose the word potential to start that with. That word shifted me. So, I mean, I don't know what it is about philosophies that I kind of like. When I want to experiment with one, I really try to take it on completely or something. Okay. And so I started out, I was raised with a religious perspective of the world. And in my mid-20s or early 20s, I kind of challenged myself to lose that, to drop it entirely. And I became I got into the materialist view that just like life is nothing but matter, and matter is all that matters or whatever. Right. And that word potential is what ultimately made me shift away from that philosophy. Despite having like kind of immersed myself in it for years, I just sat here for a while thinking about potential, like thinking through it. What the hell is it? And it's the problem with potential is that it's like real. It is something that is not tangible. It's something that cannot be achieved or whatever. And yet we can look at each other and see potential. We can see like the ultimate version of each other and see it as a reality.
Well, I love the way you've turned that correctly into, that you see the potential in others, not just in yourself.
Yes.
That there's a larger thing that lives in all of us, even if we can't define it. But it's there, and it's pushing us to be better.
And you see it when other people aren't pursuing it. You see it, and it makes you annoyed. Like you get, you can have these friends, you can have these family members, and you just think, God, like you have something special about you, and you just let it sit there, and you don't like master it, to use that word again. Right. And that's a sad, like that's something that we all get disappointed by when we're sure that we're seeing it.
Right. Or we sometimes disappoint ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I don't know, somewhere along the line, and it's a constant effort, but I do think about it. How you approach each day is a choice, and I'll have these conversations with my daughter or daughters. I have 3 daughters, but like my oldest daughter might say about anyone, "Oh, she makes me so mad," and I kind of go down this path of, no, you've made yourself mad.
Mm-hmm.
No one has the power to make you mad. You've chosen to be mad.
Yeah.
And you, in every situation, can choose how you're going to react.
Right.
In the same way that when you wake up in the morning, you can choose to be happy. And you can choose to say, I'm going to chase the better part of me today, instead of the darker parts.
Absolutely. And the practice too, another interpretation of that sentiment, like the fact that, I mean, like someone said once that what you see in someone else that you get frustrated with is actually something that you are frustrated with yourself with.
I agree.
Or about, and I think that it's so obviously true. And when I have these debates with my close friends and I feel that they're being irrational or stubborn, I get so pissed off, and it's because I know how good I can be at being stubborn, and I know how hard it is to get away from it. I know how hard it is to admit when you're wrong, and then when somebody else won't do it, it's like I'm seeing my own flaws or something.
There's no doubt, and I agree with you. And I try to, we all want to be right, but it's so hard to admit you're wrong. It's an interesting facet of our world now where social media has kind of amplified that idea.
Hasn't it, though?
And, even I'm guilty of occasionally, posting something about politics, for example. Although I really try to avoid doing that because it's not going anywhere. But people want to impose their views on one another, and then they want to argue with people, and it's a lose-lose proposition. But that social media animal is out of the box, and you're not going to put it back in.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder how things can get better, because it feels so polarized,
Oh, it is.
and it's frightening, I guess,
Yeah.
if you let it frighten you. I try to ignore it and just focus on my own thing most days, but sometimes it's hard to ignore.
What do you think when you say frightening? What does that mean for you?
Well, because I feel like despite the flaws in our history, that we've gotten certain things right, and I feel like the Bill of Rights, for instance, is a thing that I feel like, how can you argue with the Bill of Rights, and how can you argue with a document that limits the government's power over what you do, and but I feel like there are people who don't think our founders were right about anything, and would rather see it all torn down.
Yes.
And that's the part to me that's frightening, that tearing down.
Oh God, I'm so right there with you. I'm so glad you just said that.
Yeah. Because I kind of like it,
Yeah.
I kind of like the idea of America, even if it is imperfect.
Yeah.
I like the Bill of Rights, and I like a representative system of government, even if that feels broken. I think the ideas are correct. I mean, people talk about American exceptionalism and say, "Oh, that's a cockamamie idea." But what makes America exceptional is not our imperfect history, but the ideas about men being created equal, and the ideas of, I mean, if you think about Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, one of their big ideas was that the most oppressed person in history is the individual.
Right.
Not a particular kind of individual, but the individual.
Individuality, yeah.
And you can apply that to any historical situation. From slavery here in the United States to the horrors of Nazi Germany. But it all comes down to individuals being told that they're not worthwhile.
Yeah.
And, so to sort of try and build a foundation out of that idea that no individual should ever be oppressed, that's not a losing idea to me.
Yeah.
And so when I think about the tearing down that scares me, it's that.
The loss of that.
Yeah.
Man, I'm so right there with you. I'm so glad that you just expressed all that, because I have a similar experience, and so I individuality is probably at the core of my philosophy at this stage in life, and it's taken me a while to figure that out. But amidst all of this, so I'll back up a little with just my path toward these thoughts and come back. But like I said, I mean, I had this religious philosophy. And I felt when I learned how to not perceive it as true anymore, I felt very duped by it. So I learned how to take on this other perception that was pretty much the antithesis of it. And then I started to notice a very interesting other thing where I was like, sort of kind of down the line of what you're describing. Like I noticed this system of thought taking over my way of seeing things. It was like my perception was starting to get organized toward a certain conclusion.
In a better way?
No.
This is when you were in that sort of humanist.
Yes.
Okay.
And it wasn't a better way. It was what I was starting to notice was like, holy shit, this is the same way that I thought when I was religious. It's just a different conclusion.
Right.
And I was like, that's not what I expected, because I thought that I thought that the sort of like liberal atheist something or other was neutral, but I am reaching assumptions in the same way as like a Christian might or something. And I started saying things that I knew weren't
limiting.
true. Yes, it starts to like say, like squeeze on what you are willing to acknowledge.
Right.
That's what I started to notice was like in the same way that when I was deeply religious, I would deny certain truths to maintain my position, kind of practice cognitive dissonance. I was doing the same thing on the left side of the spectrum toward all this other stuff.
Right.
And I was like, shit, how do you not do that? How do you not like practice cognitive dissonance?
Right, because what happens is that if you attach yourself to an ideology,
Exactly. Yeah.
you know, if you attach yourself to an ideology, it becomes a religion.
Exactly. And that's what like, so one of my big like heroes in this transitional period was Christopher Hitchens. And he started like, he's written that book, How Religion, God is not great, or God is not good. God is not great. How religion poisons everything. And I really believe that what he actually was observing was that ideology poisons everything, because ideology, I think, is this conclusive perception of the world that is indeed sacrificial of certain knowledge that you could have. It's half of a whole story is the best way I've understood it. So when we're talking about some of the things you listed, like you take somebody who represents the conservative identity and they say, America is number one, and that's all I see is that America is number one.
Right.
Well, you're missing part of the story. America's not number one in like education. It's not number one in like happiness. There's certain areas where America isn't number one, and they're like, that doesn't fit with the conclusion I practice,
that
which
doesn't
is
fit
that
my
America,
narrative.
exactly.
Yeah.
Then you've got the other side. America's evil, and it's like, okay, well, hold on. America was, you know, if we want to list off things, America was consistent with the rest of the world in trying to get rid of some of these evils that we've practiced from the past. Like we tried to eradicate that at the same rate as a lot of the developed world.
Yeah.
We have lifted a lot of people out of poverty at a different rate than a lot of countries.
Yeah.
And we have this thing, the assumption of the autonomy of the individual and how important that is. Yeah. That's something that wasn't like we discovered, like the Western culture and the American experiment kind of discovered that and discovered how powerful it was. And it resulted in the most powerful economy that the world has ever had. Those things aren't all evil. It's kind of like when I remember having a conversation with someone about, this is an actual real example. Someone was telling me about gentrification, how much they hated it and stuff. And I was like, okay, but I've also like, I've heard people use this word a lot. I decided to read about it, and I read like in Slate or somewhere, which is a pretty left-leaning publication.
It is. Yeah.
Like, it's true that gentrification displaces people. It's true that it sometimes can be at the expense of whatever, a neighborhood culture maybe that's lasted a long time, but also it decreases poverty, decreases crime in these areas.
Yeah.
It raises the quality of life.
Yeah, it
in
raises
these
the
areas.
quality of life.
So it's just a little stubborn to just maintain the position that it is only displacement and it is only bad. And so for me, I'm trying to practice a lifestyle that is as open-minded to the whole picture of good and bad as I can be. And the best way I've found is to avoid having ideology at all costs.
Yeah, because, you know, everything is complex. Every political question we might ask is complex. And to say that there's a single answer becomes problematic for me. Mm-hmm. You know, when it comes to what we see in politics here in America, you know, my question is always, where's the pragmatic candidate?
Right.
Where's the candidate who simply just wants to find the best way to solve a problem? You know, and it's a problem for me with both sides that what we mainly see are party talking points. Mm-hmm. And, and I try to look at life like that in the bigger picture perspective, in the same way that you do, where I say, no, none of this is black and white, and none of this is simple, and there's a lot of gray area,
Yeah,
to all of it. So
we're on very similar wavelengths, I feel like. Yeah. Also, I mean, the word pragmatic is not used nearly as much as it should be, and that was another important part of my journey away from pure rationalism. So like, I was listening to a debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, trying to like, I was extremely atheistic at the time, and I was like very frustrated with these people like him, like other people who were sort of finding that, like, expressing this new language that made it sound like it was cool to be religious, or like, I mean, acceptable to be religious, which of course it is, but
Right.
I was so anti-religious at the time that I didn't think so. And I like pragmatism, a really passive statement was made, but it like possessed me to the point where I had to figure it out. And it was like the definition of pragmatism being something like the type of the behavior basically that brings about the outcome that you want, rather
Right.
than pure truth. It's based in success.
Yeah, it's based in
thriving
success.
and prosperity and all these things. So the statement was, Sam Harris was making the claim, like, if truth can't be just based in like success of an idea or life, for example, if a man finds out that his wife cheated on him and he kills himself because of it, you can't say because he died that that it's not true that his wife cheated on him. Something weird like that. Like,
Okay.
truth, if the truth of that situation is that if truth is defined, by the way, as something that produces life, there's a problem there because the truth caused a death.
Right.
The answer to that was, at least the pragmatist answer to that was, you should have paid more attention to the thing that led to your death.
Right.
That was interesting to me. And I sat on that couch for like 30 minutes working through that. Like, what does that mean? And that's pragmatism. Pragmatism is the attention to the processes that lead to the intention, the desired outcome.
Right. Yeah. And so, yeah, and that's what I look for in politicians, and I don't know that they exist.
I'm not aware of many of them myself.
Right. So, how do we turn this around back to music, or what do you want to do?
Yeah.
Or not?
I mean, this is great, but so how did you end up in this area?
I came to Greensboro 8 years ago. My wife, who is now my ex-wife, but my wife at the time was offered a job here, and we were living in a very rural area in Pennsylvania, this coal mining area.
Mm-hmm.
Which,
you were still there.
Well, I'd left. I left there and lived in New York City, but I went back because it's home.
Well, but I don't want to sidetrack you, but let's cover more of the ground in between.
Okay.
So, like, where we left off in your bio was you were from this town. You started writing songs and
started playing.
And
Right.
then you ended up in Greensboro. What happened in between?
Well, in my, I guess when I was 26, through a friend of mine, I was offered an audition for a band in New York City, or I had a chance at an audition for a band in New York City that was already signed to a big label. Mm. And they were this band was auditioning people all over the country. And I just happened to, because of somebody I knew, get an audition. And they hired me. I got that job playing bass for this band, and they were signed to Epic Sony Records. So I moved from, my very small Western Pennsylvania world to New York City. Culture shock, obviously.
I'm sure.
But it was just a whirlwind. Almost immediately started touring with these guys from New York. Recorded an album in late 1990, which was released in 91. Video and MTV, all, the whole bit. And it was a great experience, but it was a weird experience too. Because they being the leader of that band and the manager of that band, like they wanted me in their band to play bass, but at the same time they kind of devalued my experiences in cover bands, which is where I learned how to be in a band. But they didn't see any value in that. And so it was kind of a weird situation.
What does that mean?
Well, it means that they didn't really want to hear my ideas about anything.
I see.
mean, I'd played.
They thought you were less experienced than them, kind of thing.
Yeah, because I actually had played far more than the dude who was the leader of the band. But they kind of felt because I wasn't from New York and because I'd only played in cover bands that anything I knew just kind of wasn't really, they didn't want to know.
Gotcha.
They would sort of dictate how things went. So that was a weird situation. But at the same time, a wonderful situation. I got to travel all over the United States and to Japan. And I stayed with that band for a couple of years. I left in the middle of 92, partially because of what we're talking about. I didn't want people telling me what to do all the time. And I left and I moved on to other bands. I joined a band in New Jersey that released a record on Polygram in 1997. And at the same time, like I was performing solo gigs around New Jersey and in New York City. So that was kind of like my life all through the 90s. A touring bass player with a few bands, and then kind of doing my own thing when I was able. Writing songs, performing solo in New York City and in Jersey. And then sometime around the turn of the millennium, I just kind of had my belly full for a lot of reasons, and I just quit and moved back to Pennsylvania. And then I did a lot of things. I worked as a telemarketer. I drove a tractor trailer. I delivered Pepsi for 8 years.
Hell yeah.
And sort of just really said, yeah, music. That's the old Gerry.
Yeah.
So anyway, in 2014, my ex-wife was offered a job in Greensboro, and we moved down here because it was a good opportunity for her and for the kids, really, because we were living in an area that was economically depressed, where when they got older, they would have had to leave. And with Greensboro, it was kind of like, yeah, they might want to leave, but they won't have to leave.
Yeah.
So we've been here for 8 years, and it's cool.
Yeah.
It's cool. And so I finished college in 2018. Talk about late bloomers, but I worked. I did my undergraduate degree, and I got a Master of Fine Arts in Fiction in 2018. And so now I teach writing at North Carolina A&T.
Oh, cool.
But in 2021, I just said I want to start making rock and roll again because it's what I was born to do. I mean, it just circles right back to that idea of potential. Mm-hmm. And I had, for a lot of complicated reasons that we could talk another 2 hours about, and you could sort of be my therapist, but I shut off the part of me that creates music for a long time for a lot of reasons. And in early 2021, I could kind of feel it bubbling up, but in early 2021, I kind of opened that faucet again and gave myself permission to open it. So I've just been like writing and recording like crazy for the last, year and a half.
So what would you say to somebody if, say you were talking to somebody who was like an artist in their 20s or something, maybe they were jaded, maybe they were in their 30s, maybe they were jaded, maybe they weren't having the best experience. And maybe they said to you, like, sometimes I think about just shutting that door for a while. Was it a good? Is it one that you're glad? Was it a decision that you're glad you made and stepped away, or is it a regret?
Well, look, I don't. That's a weird thing, like regret, because I feel like every experience I have is valuable. So I drove a tractor trailer for 8 years, mm-hmm. and I delivered Pepsi products to Penn State University every day. And a lot of days, I said, you know what, I shouldn't be delivering Pepsi here. I should be going to school here. And a lot of days I said, I shouldn't be driving this truck. I should be, writing songs. But at the same time, like, that experience was valuable. So if I had to sort of go back and advise the 35-year-old Gerry who quit music, I would say that no matter what you do, you have to reach for the best part of yourself. And you have to do it with all your heart. But what's the right answer to that? If I hadn't quit the music business when I was 35, I wouldn't have my daughters. Like, that's a fact. Quitting the music business and moving back to Western Pennsylvania gave me my kids. When I drove a tractor trailer, like, I wanted to do it well. And I could back that sucker into all kind of tight spaces at Penn State, Mm-hmm. And that was like a cool thing. Like, I can do this. I got to get this tractor trailer between those two buildings and somehow get against a dock, and I can do it. And that was like a point of pride.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the real Gerry, I guess. Or was it? These are complicated questions.
Yeah.
All I can say is that I'm happy I gave myself permission to create again. And I guess it took me a while to recognize what's really important to me. And I should never stifle that part of me. Mm-hmm. But maybe it was okay to step away from it too. I wish I had a better answer than that.
I mean, it sounds legit to me.
Yeah.
I sort of stepped away myself at one point. So my story was that, as we were hinting at when we were getting to know each other a little while ago, I had a band that was doing pretty well on the road. We were kind of like, the momentum was building. I think we were starting to build a name pretty well. And then pretty much simultaneously, I was in a trio, and the other two band members at the same time kind of had to go their separate ways with the whole thing, with this place, with my band, with everything. And that took me off the road. I found myself in a position where I couldn't make as much money on the road by myself. I couldn't really throw together a replacement band, despite my best efforts. So I landed a job in Winston and kind of thought, like, for the first time ever, sort of said, okay, I'm going to work in this community for the first time since I was like 18.
Was it difficult?
Quit working.
To make that decision?
At first, it was, I definitely felt like I was, it's hard to say that exactly right, but I was like, I wasn't proud of myself. When I was going into this place, I felt like I was in a submissive state of mind where I was like, oh man, like I have a boss and like these people judge me, and I was used to like being on a stage and people clapping for whatever I do, and now I'm like, people are mad because I'm not pouring a soda the right way.
I so precisely know.
You know what I mean?
That feeling.
Yeah. It was like, holy shit, like I'm regular or something. And it was weird. And then time went on and I started like climbing up the hierarchy, and that started to feel different. And I remember, so I ended up becoming the manager of this place. And I remember early on into that, I think, I mean, really what was probably happening was that like the serotonin levels in my brain were rising. And I remember one morning driving to work, and for the first time ever thinking like, people depend on me. Like I matter in a system.
Right. And you were glad to be going.
Yeah. And I was like, people give a shit whether I show up or not. Like people are relying on me, and they also see me as useful. Like people think I'm good at this. I got promoted to this place. Like my boss took this risk to try me out, and I'm learning all these new skills. Like, and I ultimately, I think it reminds me of, it reminds me of another philosophy from, well, you're in fiction, so you get the idea. Like there's, one of the things I love that is spoken to me was like this piece about the story from King Arthur, where like all the knights from the Round Table, they had to, in pursuit of the Holy Grail, they had to choose a point at which the woods looked the darkest to them, the point that they didn't want to enter.
Right.
And they had to enter it there.
And that's where
they had to start. And I really, like, looking back on that, that's what it all felt like, was like, I didn't want to become responsible for something larger. I didn't want to like be useful to a business or whatever. But when I did it, it was what I needed to learn how to do, you know? And I came out on the other side being more appreciative, I think, of the music, of music as a career.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's amazing how parallel your experience is to mine, you know, because I'd spent several years making my living playing music in Pennsylvania, and then, you know, spent most of 10 years touring and playing with bands and doing what I wanted to do. And then one day I walked in to a place to work as a telemarketer, and it was like, what happened? You know, and what am I doing here? So it was that dark point of the woods.
Yeah.
And it was a long journey to kind of turn that into a positive experience. Mm-hmm. And I ended up being a boss at that place. And then moved on for various reasons to the whole truck driving thing, you know, and I think the other part of it is like especially when I drove the truck, I saw myself as, I mean, I grew up in a place where, you know, when my parents didn't talk about what do you want to be when you grow up, they talked about when you grow up, you're going to work. Mm-hmm. You know?
Yeah.
When you grow up, you're going to work because that's what people do. And there was never talk about like dreams.
Right.
And look, you know, and I'm not saying this, you know, I loved my parents, who were both gone, and I had a great childhood, but they weren't the kind of, because it's not the way they grew up. So they didn't grow up so I didn't grow up in a place where we talked about dreams and art and philosophy, and it was just like, this is what life looks like. You go to work.
Yeah.
So there was a part of, showing up to drive a truck every day that I think I took pride in that piece of it. That I was able to do it, that I was capable of it.
I know that experience too. Yeah.
Yeah.
When I did the, I built log cabins for a while, and that was kind of that was like getting my blue collar stripes or something.
Yeah.
It was like,
You've earned those boots.
Exactly. That's really, yeah.
Yeah.
Like there was something about there was something that happened. You might be saying the same thing. There was something that happened where I was like, okay, clearly my desire to be in music is like idealistic and about like my perfect life and what I feel like, oh, this would make me so happy. I was like, what if I just lean into this other side of me that's like getting connected with what it means to work for a living and be a roughneck and risk your wellness and all this stuff.
Yeah.
Like the thing that most men in America have to do,
Right.
right. If not most, a huge number of men
huge
in
chunk,
America.
yeah.
Men, there's a bunch of men that are working under fucking streets and climbing up light poles and messing with electricity and
Yeah.
fixing plumbing.
Yeah.
And what does it mean to be more like one of them and stuff? And so I did the log cabin thing, and dangerous as hell and and unpleasant as hell. But when I had no idea that I could wake up at 4:30 in the morning to go to work every day, and I had no idea I could withstand 100-degree summer days outdoors in the sun.
In the mid 90s, I joined this band in New Jersey. And, an original band doesn't make a lot of money. And when we weren't playing, touring, whatever, they hooked me up with this guy who was a roofer. And I worked as a roofer for 3 years in the mid 90s. And, the first day that I went to that job, it was a hot summer day, and we had to tear off the roof. And it was, and it was like 90 degrees. And I thought I was going to die. But I went back the next day and the next and the next and the next. And the boss was cool because it was like, okay, if you have gigs, if you have this, if you have that, you don't have to come. But when you need to come, the job's here for you. And so that's how it worked for me over a 3-year period. And as much as during the first day I thought I was going to die tearing a roof off, over the course of, say, a year, it turned into a point of pride that I could walk up a ladder with a bundle of shingles on my shoulders, or that I could set up the keyways to be straight. And, I would talk to my dad in Pennsylvania, and he'd say, could you have chosen a harder job?
I know.
And I was like, I like this job. I'm in the best shape of my life. And it's tangible. And that was the other thing that made it different from being a musician, that it was tangible.
Yeah.
That like, oh, we came here today to do a roof and it's finished. Look at that.
Yep.
And I love that aspect of it too.
Yep.
So work, man.
I mean, yeah. And, and this hints a little at, I think, where our conversation started, the whole identity component of this, that it's hard to know what's real and stuff. And there's musicians out there who wear that wardrobe still, and like they are a symbol to people who do that stuff for a living. And then there's people who really actually know what it means to relate to those people, and maybe it's because we're in our heads with our own identities kind of participating in this struggle of where we find meaning or whatever. But, I'm sure, I think what I'm getting at is if you play a show right now and a roughneck comes to that show and watches you and he sees you dressed as you are, he might identify with you despite whether or not he knows you were ever a roofer. You might not have to prove anything to him, but to me, there was something about the reality of being able to relate to people in certain ways that I didn't want to be bullshit about it if I could help it. And that was,
Right.
part of the reason I embraced certain opportunities like that in life.
Yeah, and I think the other point of it is, if we have to like draw a thread to all of this, the ultimate reason for creating possibly is to understand people. I think if I've realized anything, it's that when I sit down to write, and I mean write prose, either fiction or nonfiction, or even when I sit down to write songs, it's with questions in my mind, and I'm trying to understand shit that I don't understand. But I released an album in July called Heart in Peril, and I don't think I realized until after the fact that most of those songs, a lot of those songs, not most, but a lot of those songs are about my divorce. And that sort of came out unconsciously. But, here we are, human beings, trying to make our way, and as you so aptly put it, trying to find meaning in what we do from day to day. And maybe we're asking those questions when we try to create something.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So you were talking about you've been creating a lot, you've been writing a lot, recording a lot. So what's changed about your approach and philosophy now that you've got all this experience and you're doing this thing, you're teaching fiction writing or teaching writing, which is badass, by the way. Like, that's very cool. That I didn't know that about you. So I guess the question might be, what is different about what you're doing with music now in at this point in your life?
I think that I'm allowing myself to experience the joy of making it without necessarily worrying about who likes it or who doesn't like it. And don't get me wrong, I want people to like it.
Yeah.
And it's very satisfying when somebody says, I like that song or I love that song. But I think it's just the idea of knowing that in order for me to be the best me, which I want to be, even though I'm not, but in order for me to be the best me, I need to write songs. And I need to sit down and write prose. If I think back to my divorce, which I don't necessarily like to talk about in public, but when my days were the darkest in 2016, 2017, what I found was that the two big things that took me, that transported me away from that darkness were, one, gratitude for what I did have, and two, immersing myself in creative work. Because when I sat down to write, I forgot about all the shit in my life. Like, forgot about it. And not to say, I mean, it was obviously still present and maybe even leaked into some of my stories. But when I was working, I forgot that I was wading through shit.
Yeah.
And so there's value in that, in knowing that the creative act lifts you to a higher place and heals you. And pushes you toward that potential.
I was just in this course for a couple weeks learning about stuff. And one day we had this ridiculous experience where somebody, we had a wellness day. We had a wellness session.
Okay.
And it was just stretching and thinking, meditating.
Stretching physically.
Yeah.
Okay.
In a chair, stretching physically, thinking. And one of the things that was brought up was gratitude. And when we did this, I mean, just the 100% shift that everyone experienced from this little wellness thing was so in the air. Like everyone felt it, and everyone was so relaxed and happy and like pleased because we were in this business accelerator and everybody was stressed all the time and scared all the time. And then we did this thing and practiced some gratitude, and everybody was just jello. And
I love it.
I'm wondering like how, like what this is. I don't know how to practice gratitude all the time. This was I don't do it all the time, but what are your practices for
Well, I
that?
mean, you know, I try to think about the things that I'm grateful for every morning, and it can be, you know, it's almost like a prayer, and it can be really simple things, you know. It's 100 degrees outside. I'm grateful that I have air conditioning, and I'm grateful that I have food in the refrigerator.
Is
And
this like, okay, if you don't mind me asking, just like where it, and if you don't want to share this, you don't have to, obviously.
No,
but
it's cool.
I'm just curious where it falls in your day. Is this like right when you wake up? Is this like you're very
because
intentional?
it's usually a little later because I usually wake up. I wake up really early. I never use an alarm clock, but I usually wake up around 3:30 or 4 o'clock every
Really
morning.
early.
Well, that started when I drove truck. You know, when I was driving truck, I had to get up early.
Yeah.
So I still get up early now. But I get up and I drink coffee. I make coffee first thing. I do some stretching in my kitchen while the coffee's brewing. Then I'll sit down and like check email and stuff like that. But then I go, after a couple of, after I've guzzled coffee for a while, I go and meditate. And I don't meditate in the like Om, you know, because I've never been taught to really meditate.
Yeah.
But I have an app that I use that I like, and I think about what I'm grateful for. And sometimes it's really simple things that I'm glad I have food in the refrigerator, and I'm glad I have air conditioning or heat in the winter, and I'm grateful for my daughters, and I'm grateful for my dog, you know, because sometimes that's all we have are the simplest things. But it's, you know, it's easy to forget that there are people in this world who don't have food in a refrigerator or don't have a working furnace.
Yeah.
Or a car, you know, so my gratitude starts with those simplest, most basic things, because I realize that not everybody has them, you know.
Yeah.
Health is something to be grateful for. But I do meditate every morning. But it's not an official, I was trained to do transcendental meditation.
Sure.
It's just trying to sort of empty my mind, paying attention to my breathing, stuff like that. And I find that it's helpful.
Yeah. I'm looking for my relationship with all that stuff, and I learn about it sometimes. I listen to people talk about it. I get exposed to ideas about it, about mindfulness, about meditation.
Right.
I feel also, like, I mean, I'm very aware of the fact that I've never really learned from like a person how all this stuff works and what to do with it. I was just listening to a talk about this, I guess yesterday, about awareness, and pretty much about exactly that, about how like it's part of just all the time that we expect people to concentrate on things, or we expect ourselves to concentrate on things.
Yeah.
We don't learn how to do that though. And
Right.
like, we're not taught how to do that.
Yeah.
and that's what I run into. And I feel silly. Even when like people I know who do yoga, I'm like, I want to learn about that, but what am I going to do? Sit in my living room stretching things? Like, I don't know how to do it.
Right. Well, they say you can learn anything on YouTube now.
Yeah.
It's like, hell, I've got to fix my carburetor. I'll go look at YouTube.
I do
do
use
cars
it that
even
way.
have carburetors anymore? I don't know.
They must. I think they have to. I'm not sure though.
Right.
Who knows? Yeah, especially with electric cars. Maybe they don't. But
Yes.
anyway, what about people who? Yeah. What do you with with like a Tesla? Do you ever have to work on your own Tesla? Sure.
Yeah, right.
I wonder. I've never like
if you're one of these car junkies who's always in their garage on Saturday under
Right.
the hood, it's like that doesn't seem like that would really work with an electric car. But I've never looked under the hood of a Tesla.
I haven't either.
so
I
don't
know someone who has an older Tesla, like a OG Tesla. Maybe I'll ask him. But
Indeed.
yeah, I would. And yes, YouTube is extremely useful for such things. But
it is.
I just feel alone in that. I wish it. I guess if anything, I wish that I could have like kind of inserted some of that into my life, like at a younger age or
Right,
something.
but the cool thing about you is though that you I get the sense that you are a seeker, that you're interested in life, and that you're interested in the larger questions of life, and that you spend time considering them, and to me, that's half the battle. Instead of kind of just meandering through blindly, you're at least aware. I guess that's all we can do is to be aware that we shouldn't meander blindly, and that maybe there's something bigger than us, and that the struggle is worth it.
Yeah, that's the theme I'm noticing is in my life currently. Like I keep hearing that message come up. So to speak to that, I don't know how I might have become some sort of seeker, but I'm obsessed with something, and I'm not sure what, but I'm obsessed with something,
Right.
and it seems to guide a lot of what I do, and it has to do with life, something, maybe how we're supposed to live, but what I keep running into this message, and I've run into it again. It's about learning to love the process of what you're doing more than just the outcome.
Yeah.
And it's like you're not always aware of that until somebody wiser tells you to think about that or whatever. And I'm finding myself now really trying to learn how to practice that, because I want to sit down and enjoy the mystery of like writing a song, or the mystery of like planning out a tour and stuff. And so often it's easy to think of something like that as like, oh, what a bunch of bullshit. Like, I don't want to sit here and email people, but it's like, you can enjoy that process.
Yeah, it's all part of it. It's like even in releasing music, and you say, well, I'm not a marketer, I'm not a social media expert, and I have no clue what the hell I'm doing. But I've released a lot of music over the last year and a half, and maybe I've gotten a little better at social media, or maybe I haven't, or maybe I don't need to. And sometimes I don't enjoy that, so I avoid it. And sometimes I can get on Twitter and have a little fun. And I guess you got to follow your instincts, and trust your instincts, especially if you're looking in that direction of improvement, where that is because I make mistakes, and I'm negative sometime. And I've been depressed. I mean, and I'm not talking necessarily me, but in general. But if you can shift your focus toward, this is something I want to do, and this thing that I do might make me larger in the sense of I'm a growing, expanding being who's trying to grasp onto some wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
That if I'm facing the thing and I'm striving, it's not the end result, but it's the striving itself that builds all those muscles.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the note you just ended on, like the idea, it seems, oh, what was it? This is what it is. I was trying to kind of put together what was wrong with that, because if somebody were like, say, really into fitness, really into bodybuilding, it's like, how is there an end to that? Like, when do you reach a point where it's like, okay, now it's over and I just am it.
Right.
Like, you don't get to do that. You have to maintain it. And I remember I heard Arnold Schwarzenegger talk about when it clicked in his head. This was another, okay, let me circle back to that. But when it clicked in his head who he was trying to be, he started to perceive all of his workouts instead of this hassle, instead of this like thing where he's like, oh, this is so hard. He saw every time he did a lift as one step closer to like the identity he was pursuing.
Right.
And that's it. That's enjoying the pursuit of the thing, which also, stepping back to just another thought that we shared earlier. Another thing that I thought was really interesting about that was that he based his whole sense of identity on some movie star bodybuilder that he saw. He was in Austria. He was like in a little farm town, and he saw this guy in America that was like a bodybuilder movie star. And he was just like, I'm going to model my whole existence off of that, because that's what I want to be.
Wow.
And he did. And he obviously surpassed it, and just
right.
He never stopped
crazy.
defining goals and just pursuing them. But that's like this weird other side of the whole idea of authenticity. It's like, it's kind of like what we're talking about with archetypes. Like, it's cool to be true to yourself, but sometimes it seems that it's useful for people to see a path towards success, at least see an icon of success, and be like, okay, I know what I have to do to get from where I am right now to get closer to that icon of success.
Right. Even with writing, I can remember I hadn't written much, but I would think about writing. And then, especially in my late 20s, early 30s, I was obsessed with Jack Kerouac. And I read all of his books, and I read all of his books more than once. But when I first said, hey, maybe I want to write, I was imitating him, without a doubt. And that act of imitation can lead you to your own thing, because you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, that Schwarzenegger story is great.
Yeah, I mean, it's useful, and that's especially in youth. But I think even still, I think it's interesting that those things are at odds with each other. They are for me. For me, I'm always trying to think like, no, I shouldn't be copying other people or whatever. I should be making sure I pursue myself, and that's true to an extent. But there are times where I think it's at least useful to look at somebody else and say, you know what? If that person is nothing else, they remind me of the result that I want for myself.
Oh my, that's brilliant. Yeah. I read the Elvis Costello autobiography earlier this year, and I didn't know this, but all of those early great albums, which I love, he was always imitating somebody. But in saying, okay, I love this record, and I'm going to try to write something like it, but it never ended up sounding like that thing. It always ended up sounding like Elvis Costello.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what a cool concept that is. And he is obviously very much Elvis Costello, and has had such, and still is very vital as an artist. He's like maybe not out there on the radio, but he just released a new album this year and toured, and it's so cool.
Yeah. And I like him too. He was somebody that I noticed was also kind of embracing of the whole, I'm going to have people on stage and ask them questions and shit. And for me, that's sometimes been, I love interviewing people, like as much as I like play. Like I love conversations with people.
Yeah.
And he was somebody that inspired me in that way, because he didn't seem to have any insecurity about doing both things, being seen as both things.
Yeah. And he's so articulate.
Yeah.
It's crazy when you hear him being interviewed, and how incredibly articulate he is, and it just blows me away. Must have read a lot of books.
Maybe so, or copied people who did. Man, I guess on that note, we're gonna wrap it up here in a second.
Yeah.
One thing, one last curiosity. We're really out of time. One last curiosity. Yeah, throughout the conversation, I've been curious. Do you mind if I ask if you're like religious or anything?
No, I don't mind. I grew up in a very Catholic house, and I mean very Catholic, and sang on the choir and was an altar boy and all those things, and very much parallel to you. When I got into my 20s, I questioned all of it, and probably at some point rejected a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
But even that is, if you talk about the idea that we're all paradoxes, I don't think I ever fully rejected the idea. Even as I rejected the ceremony around it, and my mom I would be on tour like somewhere in Wisconsin, and I would call my mom and she'd say, "Did you go to church today?" Well, no, Mom, I didn't. And she'd be disappointed, and I'd say, there are people who go to church every Sunday, and maybe, maybe I'm on better spiritual footing than they are. But maybe I'm not, but maybe I am.
Yeah.
So at any rate, I've come back around to the idea that even if I can't define it, I absolutely believe that there's something larger than me.
Yeah.
And that something deserves my attention. Do I think it's a guy in the sky with a beard? No. I don't know what it is. So is that Catholic? Am I a Catholic? I don't know. But I don't, if you talk about just the considerations that you and I have discussed and the idea of potential,
mm-hmm.
Even the perception of wrong and right that seems to me to be an innate thing, I don't think any of that shit is an accident. I think it's impossible that it would be an accident. But I'm just a guy from Pennsylvania, so what do I know?
Well, I really like how you said all that, particularly the use of the word attention. I think that's really cool. And I relate, man. There's at least a mystery in life, and like I used to be very dismissive of it, and used to treat it as if it weren't worthy of dignity or something. Right. And there's something about just being willing to offer that attentiveness, that attention, that acknowledgement of some kind.
Yeah.
That I think it's more interesting to me now than it's ever been. So I guess my last question what would you say to your daughters, to your friends, to your fellow artists, to whatever? What is your sort of philosophy in life? What is your sort of like, if I had to end the conversation on this note, the note would be this. What would that be for you?
I think it would be that even if I'm not a perfect example of it, that number one, you should never conform to anyone else's idea of what you're supposed to be, ever. And number two, that you have the power to shape your own life. And that's it.
That's a perfect note to end on. Let's let it rest there.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been great.
This has been great. Thank you for this conversation, for real.
You're welcome, Tyler. Thank you.